is basically going to help with, she's the supervisor of consumer services, and she'll cover communications and conservation tips. Scott Rogers, the electric division manager, is going to assist with questions at the end. Besides providing water, there's no more important issue for sewer, light, and power than serving our residents and businesses reliable and affordable electricity. Reliability is fundamental to everything we do as a critical service provider. We want to make sure the lights keep on and the water keeps flowing from the faucet. But today we're going to focus on the electric side of things with CWLP and what's going on with the electric grid and the energy market. And with developments in the Midwest region causing energy shortages never seen before and impacting the energy markets, we do appreciate the invitation to come and present here today, for the chamber. This is a complex issue, but we want to make sure that residents and businesses know, and they actually deserve an explanation to help everyone understand, what the impacts are going to be here in Springfield. Some of the key points really, power plants are retiring at an alarming rate because state and federal laws and environmental regulations, along with a lack of economic incentives, are resulting in premature retirements much faster than MISO actually expected. All investor-owned power plants and will be closing in the state except for Unit 4, which is ours, and Prairie State Complex, which is in Southern Illinois. And I want to make sure I'm clear on this next point. There is no rate increase from Citywide Light and Power. The fuel adjustment on the customer's bill, though, does vary depending upon what the purchase power is for that given month. And I'll explain that a little bit more here soon. So I want to thank Mike for having us, on board so we can get this message out to everybody. So let me continue here with the slide. So our agenda, we're going to cover resources, basically, and kind of explain what MISO is and how it relates to us, market impacts, discuss basically the energy warnings that have come out this year, discuss reliability and emergency planning, and then get to some conservation alerts and rolling blackouts and what that means, along with conservation tips for that. And I've said this for many years, especially last year during the energy legislation debates, as Mike probably remembers. We need a balanced approach. Utilities must be reliable, resilient, affordable, and responsible. Moving too fast to a zero carbon future is definitely creating issues. And these issues that I will basically discuss as we continue through the presentation, and they're going to persist. This isn't just this year, this summer. This is many years that's going to continue if something doesn't change. And let me just say, if you don't already know, Mike did a great job last year trying to stop the bad energy legislation and trying to come up with something that doesn't jeopardize the electric grid. He did, vote against the energy legislation. And one of the issues with that, it's not necessarily what's retiring units, but it's definitely going to prevent future units from being built in the state. So it does leave us in a little bit of a problem with a reliable grid when renewables just aren't ready to basically provide that backup supply that we need. So Mike's really familiar with what's going on here. So let me cover generation resources that we have to cover peak demand. Dahlman 4 and our peakers. So we have Interstate Factory and Reynolds, and those cover almost all of our load throughout the year, except for basically a short period of time when it's the highest peak demand. So it's basically only when it's extremely hot and there's a small percentage of the load that we can't cover. We did transmission upgrades last year to improve import capability when our other units retired here, especially Unit 33. Some of the conservative operations that we have are internal, so we can actually shed some load internally within our operation, as well as delay or stop maintenance, return basically equipment to service, as what we call that when we get into some of the MISO alerts and things. Some of the basically the hazard planning that we do on the electric service side of things. Are basically our dispatchers and operators within electric operations. They plan for all weather events, cyber attacks, events with generation and transmission and distribution, and what they call MISO energy emergencies. And I'll explain what happens with MISO next. Basically, our operators are certified under NERC, which is the National Electric Reliability Council, and they have to have many educational hours to be given that certification. So what is MISO? MISO basically is the entity that manages our regional electric grid. And you can see as a picture for across the United States here, it's kind of a north, central, and southern zones that they have. There's 10 of them, and it goes from Louisiana up into Canada. Most of Illinois is zone 4, as they call it, and that's really everything south of I-80, and everything north of I-80 in Illinois is part of basically another grid operator, which is called PJM. So that's why Chicago is a little bit different than what we are. MISO is a reliability and a market coordinator. It's 2 separate functions, but they act together essentially to provide a reliable electric grid. It's considered like an air traffic controller, but they're basically controlling the right amount of electricity that's generated and transmitted to the utilities for all the load that they have. They don't own any generation or transmission. What they are is they're policy takers, not makers. So they can't override regulations and state mandates to protect electric grid reliability. The only reliability factor they have say over for the grid is transmission reliability, but it's not oversight for reliability for capacity. So they can't really direct generation to stay open just if there's a capacity shortfall. They leave that basically to the states to do that. They do administer buying and selling of energy and capacity while managing constraints in the electric grid. An electric constraint for electric grid is basically like when a transmission or a generation asset's impaired, and there's a restriction on the flow of power essentially through the system. That's what's called a constraint. The benefit, though, that the grid supports us is when our generation is not available or we need to cover the peak demand, that's what being a member of a regional grid is a benefit. It's basically a mutual aid concept for utilities. Texas and ERCOT is an example, basically with limited import capability by design. In 2021, which was last year, basically they had the winter freezes that occurred and a lot of outages, and people were without power for weeks, basically because they could not import the power that they needed. So now I'm going to cover some of the market impacts for capacity and energy and how they're affecting costs. There are 2 components to buying energy, essentially. One is capacity, which is like a reservation ahead of time for the right to that energy that could be needed. And then the energy is actually the component of what you're using at the time that you're using it. So MISO, they basically have what they call a capacity auction. And the results were pretty dramatic this year. The capacity auction that procurement process is like a residual market. It's not meant to buy all of your capacity needs for your load. So they're expecting you to have some generation, some contracts in place to cover a majority of your capacity. But the costs were 50 times higher due to a large shortfall. And what that meant is that there's not enough generation being put into the auction, so they weren't bidding into the auction. What that's from is basically a lot of thermal generation coal plants decided that they were going to pull out of the auction because they're going to retire. And we'll get to why these plants are retiring, because it's a big deal. So that basically that firm capacity from thermal baseload generation is greatly decreasing, where renewable energy is not coming on quick enough, but it's also it's intermittent. So it's not fully accredited because it only works when the sun shines and the wind blows. So it's valued a lot less. the load forecast increased higher than projected as well. So that meant there's a lot more energy being used than what was expected within the whole MISO footprint. So with scarce capacity, basically a 5,000 megawatt shortfall in our area, prices jumped. And here is a slide that basically kind of indicates what the prices were in the different zones. So in the southern region, it was a lot cheaper, but in all the central and northern zones, prices jumped from $5 a megawatt day last year to over to $236 per megawatt day this year. So it's a significant increase, and it's kind of a big problem, I think, with MISO's process, and then also a lack of state requirements for capacity. So what does owning our own generation do for us? Well, it provides a shield. So I think it's really a good time to recognize how important having control of our own generation and having Unit 4 in operation with stable pricing is a good shield to market instability. And when we're looking at the impacts to our area, we can expect to have some protection thanks to having Unit 4 in our peaking units. But we know we can't escape all of the potential cost impacts that what happens to the regional grid. So for capacity costs, we have our own generation that provides that value. We have bilateral purchases for that, for the additional what we need, and then what's left over is basically put into a yearly auction. And that provides our capacity requirements to MISO. So when we're dealing with the costs for this, Ameren announced basically an increase of $48 per month for their average residential customer. And for our costs that we see will be less than a few dollars per month for our average residential customer for the increase in capacity costs. Now, trying to translate that to businesses is a lot more difficult because there is no average customer. All of our businesses are in different rate classes, and there's a lot more complexity to those. So it's really hard to predict that. Plus, it depends on what the load is for that time when it comes to the fuel adjustment. But our generation, so I guess in other words, let me finish with that. This is probably about a 2 cent per kilowatt cost on average in the fuel adjustment bill. So that's what we're looking about. So when you're looking at your usage, it's probably going to be about two cents per kilowatt hour. That's going to change roughly month to month, depending upon the whole generation or the whole load that's produced for that given month. So it's based on usage. But our generation that we have is worth about 23 million in capacity in this year's market that we didn't have to buy. And then we do have hedges too that are worth about 1.4 million that if we would have had to buy all in the auction, it would have cost about 10.3 million. So we've done well with managing our exposure in the markets that we're very well hedged between our generation and bilateral purchases. Now, energy, we can cover 99% of our load 95% of the time. So what that means is that it's only that very top peak that we can't cover. And it's basically when we look to purchase power, we have to buy it from the market to cover that peak, or if one of our units are actually down on an outage. So now on to electric reliability. The reliability and resiliency of the electric grid is definitely a front and center issue around the whole country. And, we've spent a lot of time the last few years trying to get lawmakers and regulators to understand the impacts of accelerated decarbonization rules before reliable replacement resources are available. But unfortunately, our concerns, here about reliability and cost in the MISO grid are too soon coming to fruition. But no one thought that the grid would experience it this fast. No indications from MISO previously, had expected this, and it is due to those plants retiring at such a fast rate sooner than expected. And these are very big plants that are looking to retire throughout the state and other states as well. So MISO warns a risk for rolling blackouts this summer. We're basically estimating a 5,000 megawatt energy shortfall in the entire regional grid for MISO in the north and central regions. And basically that's a lack of firm generation in that area during peak times when the load is at its highest. And MISO basically attributed the shortfall primarily with, because of the higher demand, but also because of the reduced electric generation available to baseload generator retirements. The worst shortfalls they predict are for July, but also June and August are slightly affected. Really, it more depends upon how what the weather's actually doing with basically the high temps and the heat waves. The risk is relatively low though for 2022, but it's going to increase in 2023, and the reason for that is that a lot of these plants that pulled out of the capacity market caused a lot of alarm for MISO, but they're still operating for 2022. So even though they're not in the capacity market, they're still available to be called upon to run. So basically MISO, and there's another entity that looked at that and said, okay, well, we should be okay in 2022, but there's still a risk. In 2023, though, it will get worse if those plants retire. The rolling blackouts or the rotating outages, they're really temporary protective power outages that help bring balance to supply and demand on the electrical grid. So some of the energy market issues that we're going to discuss, I mean, it's really a complicated issue with basically natural gas costs, supply chain issues, and more that play into what's causing this turmoil. Base load units or thermal units, which really here in Illinois is mainly coal-fired units, are retiring at a much faster pace than expected. There's a lack of new generation. So what's in MISO's queue, as they call it, is not ultimately what gets built. So there's a lot of projects that are shown in what MISO has is what they call their queue that looks like they're going to get built. But only 10 to 20% of that actually does get built. So when people say there's a lot of renewables coming, there shouldn't be a shortage, there's no reason for it, they don't understand MISO's processes or their numbers. So that's something that has to be understood, that again, 10 to 20% get built. So there's not that much generation being added as what's needed if all these units are falling off and retiring. Renewables, again, they're not being installed fast enough, but they're also not accredited the same as thermal-based load units. Again, they don't have the same capacity value because they're intermittent resources. Solar pricing has been increasing as well with market forces the way they've been occurring. Basically, there's issues with increased costs in shipping, metal increases, the tariff issue as well on solar panels, which they're about ready to resolve that now. But it increased prices substantially for all those solar projects. So that pretty much put a halt on a lot of them from being installed, or at least moving forward with. Natural gas prices increasing, basically doubling since last year because of the Ukraine war, but other government policies, it's not just the only thing. Basically started a lot of the huge increases in energy prices earlier this year. Deregulation is another issue that's in this state. The Illinois energy policy, basically that separated generation from our investor-owned utilities. And so it decoupled traditional reliability requirements from generation ownership. Merchant generators, so in these plants that are, they don't have any reliability requirement in this state to keep base load units running. They sure didn't have any financial incentive to do so either. Illinois and Michigan are the only states where utilities are not vertically integrated in MISO. Municipal utilities are different, such as City Water and Power. We are vertically integrated, but we're a small fish in a big ocean. So what we do has little impact on the regional electric grid. But all of these factors do contribute to the MISO warnings and the energy market prices. So just to understand that, MISO isn't the only ones that are, describing what these issues are, but the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, which is actually governed by the federal side of things with what they call FERC, they issued a reliability assessment and for 2022. Most of the U.S. was elevated to a higher risk, but MISO in the middle is the highest risk out of the country. And they noted that MISO's same capacity issues, transmission weakness. They cited droughts that affect basically hydro plants, but droughts also impact like heat events because it increases demand for load. There's supply chain issues. There's some coal plants that have low stockpiles of coal, but not City of Light and Power. We do have a reliable, stable coal supply. Cybersecurity threats from Russia and others are a concern. They've mentioned solar tripping. So basically May and June of last year, Texas had widespread solar farms that had sudden loss events. So there was a lot of solar generation that just fell off, immediately. It's also seen before in California as well. So MISO's central and northern and southern regions are not the only areas with issues. California, Texas, they're having similar problems. California has dealt with rolling blackouts for some time, but they're taking steps right now to bring on gas plants and slow down nuclear shutdowns to avert, shortages. They also have, wildfire risks out in California and Canada because it can affect transmission lines. Actually, California recently announced it was producing 100% of its energy with renewables. But then a few days later, they announced it would have trouble meeting summer peak loads, predicting a 1,700 to a 5,000 megawatt shortfall. So, it's got to be understood that renewables necessarily aren't the full answer. So what's driving plant retirements? Technical difficulty here. Well, the first thing is economics. So when you look at that over the last 10 to 15 years, it includes a lot of environmental regulations that require heavy capital investment into these plants. And the general question is why would any thermal plant invest any kind of money for those heavy capital investments when it's losing money against the market? There are no requirements from the state of Illinois to maintain a level of local capacity either. There are no financial incentives just to keep these plants open. So, and then, financial institutions and insurance companies are walking away from thermal plants and actually even discouraging from, those investments being made, as well as even going into new fossil fuel type plants. They're, being discouraged. Versus basically your non-dispatchable, renewables. That seems to where they want to go. So the legislation that's been passed in the state overall, in the history, is basically discouraged thermal plants from being built. So all the investor-owned plants, again, they'll close, leaving only our Unit 4 and the Prairie State Complex. That's below, down in Southern Illinois. So what are the steps to prevent rolling blackouts? Rolling blackouts are a last resort, but there's steps that we take to mitigate, those actions from even being taken. So before we get to that level, there's things we're going to do to try to prevent that. So one of the first things, MISO basically, they determine all of this. They determine what events taking place, make the declaration, and they'll communicate that and send out the orders to utilities. So during a regional grid emergency, MISO will take these steps by importing energy from other regional grid operators that are outside the system, so like PJM or the Southwest Power Pool. Those other entities, they will import energy from them. They will request basically what they call a conservative operation, so we can delay maintenance and return equipment to service. We'll bring on our gas plants, and then we'll actually make public appeals to voluntary conserve energy. And we'll try to hit our top 100 customers as well as a broad appeal to the general public. But the last resort, again, is the rolling blackouts, or we call, load shedding. So MISO is going to tell us basically what load to shed, and we'll take the appropriate action. We've actually had some practice with MISO alerts. We've had like 7 or 8 last year. They never did get to the conservation stage. It was more of just a preparation stage. And then we've had actually alerts in May and June this year during the heat waves. You've probably seen some of that in the media as well. But it was attributed again to increased loads with generation and transmission lines out of service. So when MISO gets to these watches and warning stages, the steps begin for public appeals for conservation to come into play. So they're going to tell us to shed a certain amount of load through electric conservation, and then we'll issue that watch or warning again to our top 100 customers or to the general public. But it could come at basically probably like a certain hour of the day. We're typically seeing peaks usually hitting between 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. in the evening. And they would expect energy conservation to start and continue until that order is lifted. And it's really during the week, during the afternoon, when the load is at its highest. So what is a rolling blackout? Basically power outages to avoid total system blackouts. And by total system blackout, that means the entire electric grid, the regional electric grid, has failed. So MISO, they're going to order utilities to shed a certain amount of load in emergencies, and then utilities perform this, through these protective outages, because the energy is ultimately just in time delivery. Okay, trying to relate that more to everyone can understand. Load and generation must be perfectly matched on the grid, or it kind of spiral out of control. Brownouts, black and total blackouts can't occur if we don't keep the grid balanced. But brownouts, I want to make sure it's understood, because the media was kind of getting this confused. They're not the same thing as a rolling blackout. Brownouts are unplanned voltage drops that can damage system and equipment. Maybe such as like a transformer that's failed, or if we didn't conduct the rolling blackouts, the load being higher than the generation will cause the voltage to drop, resulting in brownouts. This is something we do not want. We do not want brownouts. Load shedding and planned controlled power outages can help balance the supply and demand of electricity over the transmission system when generation deficiencies exist. And what we don't want is a total blackout of the entire grid, because in 2003, the East Coast had an entire blackout, a total blackout, and it took about 48 hours to restore all the customers, compared to what we're proposing as a rolling blackout for 15 minutes of time. So how are we going to implement rolling blackouts? Well, first of all, we want to minimize the impacts to our customers. That was our primary concern. And MISO, they're going to tell us what time to start to shed load and how much. In a load shedding event, it's going to start the time they basically state, but it's going to basically last until further notice. Basically until that they can see what the effects are and they can gauge what the impact is. So they might say that it's a kind of a 2 to 8 time frame, but everybody's gonna have to understand that they will continue until the emergency event is mitigated. When MISO orders us to shed load, our dispatchers will look at circuits throughout our system to determine which circuits they can start rotating through. And what they do is they group circuits together to match the required load shed, and then implement an outage lasting around 15 minutes, and then switch to the next group until the order is lifted. Rolling blackouts can affect more than one circuit at a time, depending upon the required megawatt reduction needed by MISO. Where our outages are limited to 15 minutes, other utilities are expecting outages of 60 to 90 minutes for their customers. Again, we're trying to do our best to lessen the impact to our customers by limiting the outage to around 15 minutes. The main hospitals have dedicated circuits that are excluded from the rolling blackouts. It is impossible, though, to remove every healthcare facility from this exposure. The mayor and City Water, Light and Power, though, will be meeting with the main hospitals to discuss this in more detail very soon. Because I know we have some people from the medical community on the call now, so I want to make sure that's clear. One of the things we often get asked is why can't we be our own island? You know, we have, you know, our own generation. Why can't we do that? Here's the reason, though, is that the regional electric grid covers our load when our generation resources are not available to cover our peak load. So we can't just disconnect from the regional electric grid whenever we want. We rely on them for basically that mutual aid. Again, that the Texas ERCOT is basically like a near island with limited import capability. They went without power for weeks for some of their customers because of them not being connected to a wider regional grid. The other thing that to understand is that the regional grid is so short of capacity in the gigawatts that basically, even if we had all our retired generation in the history of CWLP, it would not be enough to cover the shortage. We would need to have 25 unit 4s to make up the difference to avoid rolling blackouts. That would, you know, that wouldn't be fair to our own customers or, you know, to the community to have that much generation essentially in the city of Springfield. That's something that should be spread across, you know, the entire state of Illinois and the other states in MISO. Building new coal or gas plant units in Illinois doesn't fit with new regulations in Illinois either. If a total blackout of the regional electric grid does occur, though, the good thing is that we have black start capability. So we can bring back units and disconnect from the regional electric grid if that occurs. So if the whole grid goes down, we open our ties up, and then we can black start our interstate gas turbine with our factory and rentals units through transmission line assets. So improving reliability, continuing on with this black start concept, even though we can do that with, you know, again, with some of our units and connecting them through transmission lines, there's more we can do, I think. So we can add new generation of 25 megawatts or less to comply with the energy bill that was done last year. It was called CJA. We could go look at, you know, if that law was in effect, we could actually consider building larger units. But what this does is it adds energy and capacity while strengthening reliability. So when we look at improving black start capability, having it more localized next to the units that we're trying to start is even more reliable because we don't have to rely on transmission lines. Like in 2006, when we had a tornado come through the city, it did affect some of our transmission lines. So we were lucky that we were able to actually still black start interstate during that time frame. But having them more localized is better. So if we add units at interstate gas turbine, we can do a small study to determine the right sizing, and it's going to require, you know, smaller units essentially, and we can burn fuel oil and have storage on site as well as a backup fuel to natural gas. We also want to look at putting units at unit 4 for black starting unit 4 at our power generation facility. So these are two separate locations. But the amount of generation could be an issue. as well as, and that's the number of megawatts that we need to black start Unit 4 is definitely a lot higher than interstate, because we have very, very large motors at Unit 4. The amount of natural gas and delivery of natural gas to the site is also an issue. So more complex studies have to be completed for that. But one of the most exciting projects that we're moving forward with, and Mike was a big proponent of this too, and very helpful in us moving forward in this project. So basically, it's going to allow for most of the carbon to be captured out of the basically of the emissions of the plant. It's not zero carbon though. So the energy legislation that was passed last year calls for zero carbon. So what this does, though, I think this allows potential for more coal plants to be built in the future, but the law will have to be revisited to allow for this technology to actually provide the value of it to provide reliable electric grid. That's going to be important in the future, and they're going to have to do that by 2038 at least, before some of the caps on Unit 4 as well as Prairie State Complex occurs, because they use at least one of their units completely down there in 2038. We were lucky to basically arrange for Unit 4 to stay on until 2045 with a slight reduction in generation because of the emission caps that they used. So now I'm going to turn it over to Amber Saban to talk about our alerts and conservation tips and how that's communicated.
Hello, I will let Doug advance the slides for me. I am our supervisor of consumer services and I handle our public information activities. So I'm here to tell you the stuff that you want to know for locally. What is this going to look like during an energy emergency? So if we get to conservation, if we get to, hopefully we don't get to rolling blackouts, what we're going to have to do for those. Here's a look at all the things that go into influencing an electric grid and why MISO has to look at so many things and give so many advanced warnings. They're looking at peak load forecasts, costs, weather, and then they have a number of conservative operations declarations and advisories that they give out. Next. So what we are going to do is sync our notifications to match up with MISO, because I know it can be confusing. If you see on the media, CWLP says, get ready to conserve, or we're not there yet, but heads up. We know how headlines can go left or right in the public. So what we've got is basically green level is go and use or save energy as you wish. Yellow is your watch, and kind of like a tornado watch, it just means it's an advisory, watch out, be ready. Orange is going to be when we say to our top 100 customers and our public appeals as they need to go to please go conserve energy. We'll give you those tips here in a minute. Then red level is the MISO event emergency protective power outages, rolling blackouts. And again, we're going to roll those in 15-minute increments. The operator will rotate the circuits until the emergency is over. Hopefully we don't get to that step. If we do, we'll be prepared to inform our customers the best we can. Okay, next. Then we do have a social media presence and a good relationship with the media, but we've got imagery to make it really easy to understand, plan for no emergency, to watch to conserve, to go conserve, and then protective power outages, the rolling blackouts. And then we have our social media channels, again, our news releases, and some different customer notifications, and obviously our website presence to make that known. Next. So in order to keep the public the most informed, if you're aware of all the ways for city notifications to come your way, we encourage you to have updated account information on file with us, email addresses, mobile numbers that are associated with your account. We do have the mycwlp.com online account management. And then we have some options for city text alerts, neighborhood news. There's different ways to sign up. I put my public information email box on here. And then we do maintain a top 100 electric user email list. Some of you are on here that are already on that. So we'll want to update you guys, especially when the conservation alerts and the requests come forward. Next. Then here is just a snapshot to right now. We have our FAQs and all the conservation tips that we're going to show you briefly here are on our homepage, easy to find. We expect we'll build this, as we go through the next few summers, probably with MISO watches. Then I wanted to show you also our outage map. And many don't know you can put in your street number and then your account phone number on our outage map. And it will verify, yes, we know you're in an outage. You can also click on the outage icon and it may say equipment failure, maintenance outage. I suppose we'll probably put in there for status rolling blackout when we have those. But again, they'll roll off and on in 15 minutes. Next. So here are ways to reduce for energy emergencies. We will make these voluntary requests to reduce. We're going to be looking at, saving energy for an energy emergency is a little bit different than just general energy conservation. That's good to do year round to reduce your usage. But for specified hours, peak hours, hot temps, or if we're in an extreme cold, these are quick steps. Well, obviously not the thermostat one for the cooling season, but these are steps that you can take to help reduce load that the city of Springfield is going to need to do, along with, again, this is MISO's direction, and all the member utilities are all going to be working to get all of their customers to conserve, just like we will here at Springfield. So turning off lights, postponing appliance use, major systems, disconnecting things that take electric while they're standing by. You can shade your windows. And then, next you have a lot of large use in businesses, sometimes on your dehumidifiers, unplugging water fountains, chilled water, addressing those temperatures up by 5 degrees. If you have showroom displays and things that you can take off for a few hours, we'd encourage you to do that. That's an easy way to get electric usage down. And then we also have our energy services office. We couldn't have anyone here today, but they're available year round for technical assistance, bill analysis. We have a city lights rebate for commercial lighting to get you over to more efficient lighting for your businesses. And then this is just a snapshot of more of what they do. The helping homes and rebates. So I told Mike that we could get you guys any more information, follow up any questions that you have, and help you out through this time of energy emergencies.
Thank you, Amber. At this point in time, I would like to ask the mayor. He indicated he would like to say a couple words before we get to the question and answers. So, Mayor, are you ready?
Well, thanks, Mike, for putting this together. And I'll just take a just short amount of time. But if there's questions that still remain after this is over, we'll go as long as you want. But just get them to the chamber or to springfield.il.us and we'll get those answered. But real quick, we've had discussions with MISO, and they said there's requirements that we have to go through, and this is part of it. They felt that the ability to have a blackout is remote, but they want us to go through this process to forewarn everybody so everybody can prepare if we have that worst case scenario. So you prepare for the worst, hope for the best. but they've never had to do a blackout previously. The other thing I should state is they have gone further, and it's my understanding that MISO has bought other energy capacity and energy from other ISOs to help get through this, or the peak times that Doug had mentioned. And then last thing, when Doug mentioned 25 Unit 4 generators that we'd have to build to offset the gap. Just to give you an idea, Unit 4 costs $500 million. So that'd be over $10 billion. So it's not practical. We wouldn't, you're providing energy across multi-states. And so we're part of the grid. And unfortunately, you know, that's what we're, you know, dependent upon it. And that's the reliability factor that Doug alluded to, where Texas didn't have that. So with that, we'll just open it up for questions, and this will be an ongoing discussions. But again, they said it's a remote possibility, but we have to go through this process to make sure everybody's prepared and do our part as much as possible to avoid any blackouts, not only in Illinois, but other states as well.
Thank you, Mayor. Doug, before I open it up, there's no questions yet in the chat, but I do have one. You know, I appreciate you explaining there are going to be 15 minutes if we do have a blackout. How soon would we know if our particular area of town is going to be blacked out, or will it come as a surprise to us? Will we just all of a sudden not have power, or will we have any forewarning?
Well, again, like what Amber kind of discussed, that, you know, how we're going to warn. So there'll be an indication that something could be coming when we start issuing the conserve, you know, the alert, the warning. You know, there's even the pre-warning, kind of what we did last Tuesday. We sort of kind of brought that out to like, hey, this is really starting to happen now. That MISO's, you know, their concern has grown enough, you know, to where they started issuing basically for us to go into conservative operations and preparing for how we're going to communicate to the public. So we wanted to kind of get that message out there as well. But when it comes down to, you know, the point of past conservation, you know, after everybody's conserving, that time frame can vary for MISO. It depends on a number of things. It depends how fast the load is increasing. It depends if there was maybe a generator that tripped offline somewhere, or a transmission type outage that happened. That could really escalate things to where it could even be no notification from MISO that we have to start actually, you know, shedding load immediately. Whatever they direct us to do, that's what we have to, you know, we have to perform that task, let's say. So we'll try to give as much warning as we can when we know about it, to, you know, basically elevate that to, you know, let people know kind of what's going on. You know, it's something that's really, I think, has a lot of people concerned, and everybody should be. But again, you know, trying to limit to 15 minutes hopefully will lessen that impact to some extent. So
how large of a, well, if you have to do a rolling blackout, what percentage of Springfield will be affected by each one of those events?
It depends on the load shedding requirement from MISO. But we have enough circuits through the town that for what we think, you know, what we expect might be our portion, let's say, you know, it's going to last hours before we might have to cycle back through again. So it's not something that if we hit one circuit, let's just say one part of town, and they were out 15 minutes, we're not coming right back to them within 30 minutes or an hour. You know, it's going to be much further down the line. And our dispatchers will also basically look at those areas, and as they cycle through them, let's just say if it happened today, they would be going through those circuits until basically the event ended. Once the event ended, they would look at, if it happened again tomorrow, they would start at the next circuits. They wouldn't redo those circuits that just had it today. So, you know, we're trying to spread this out as fairly as we can, you know, and trying to minimize the impact for everybody.
Thank you. I have a question here from Gus Gordon from the Hoagland, and it kind of piggybacks again. And so I hope maybe you will have something to add to your answer. But he says, I'm concerned about what happens when the power goes out in the middle of a show with a full house. Our main theater seats 450 people. So that could become a public safety issue. Is there any way to request times to avoid?
No, unfortunately, there's not. I mean, there's no way that we can accommodate everybody's requests, because you got to understand that everybody's going to have a request for something. You know, it affects their business. Everybody's affected differently, you know, it's something that's probably going to occur between about 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. typically, if it does occur. You know, conservation, and then any kind of rolling a blackout type of thing. But yeah, there's really no way to sit there and isolate every circuit in the city of Springfield for everybody's request.
So when our businesses are planning their contingency plans, they have to plan for the worst case scenario. They have to plan that it's going to come at the least opportune time, and just prepare for that. Just like if you're in my old restaurant, it would just plan on it would happen at peak time, service time, and figure out what you were going to do with lack of computers, lack of anything. 15 minutes is good, and the fact that you're not looking at a lot of downtime on things that require a cooler or something like that. However, it's important to have a contingency plan for worst case scenario. Would you agree with that, Doug?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I would encourage, you know, emergency type planning for businesses, for just in general, for like even during storms, you know, or we do have a lot of vehicular accidents that take down power poles, and you know, our linemen do a great job of getting power back pretty quickly. Our average outage is probably less than an hour, but it's still, there's a lot more exposure to those types of events, and they occur, you know, regularly on the system, you know, between storm damage and other types of vehicle accidents that occur in the system.
Well, you bring up a good point. It's probably good for all of our businesses to have a contingency plan, not only just for rolling blackouts, but for power outages normally as well. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does somebody have a question? You can unmute yourself right now and ask. If not, please feel free to send me an email. I'm putting my email in the chat right now. Send me an email at any time. And Doug and Amber and Scott have been very gracious with me over the years, not just in regards to this matter, but anytime I've reached out to them, they've been very helpful and getting me answers. And I do have another question. Can you project how far in the future before we might see blackouts?
Well, again, so they're expecting this year could be the start of it, but the situation isn't going to change anytime soon. They're definitely projecting this out multi-years out, 5 to 7 years out, that we're going to anticipate problems. Renewables are not going to save us anytime soon. And the amount of land that's going to take for the solar and wind farms to be installed, and remember, they're valued a lot less than thermal baseload units because they're not reliable at every moment in time. So it's going to take a long time for that to develop, as well as like battery technology too. It's still too far behind, and too costly. Concerns that I have with batteries are the battery fires that occur. They had one out in Australia that lasted a week. So those are real issues, and also disposal of these products for communities to deal with, for solar panels, turbine blades, and you know, used batteries. So I think it's a big thing that needs to be dealt with, but it needs to be done in a transitioned way to where everything is, you know, keeping grid reliability at the forefront instead of letting it fall behind like it has been. But it's going to be up to really the state and federal regulators, legislators, to help address this issue. But you know, I do expect this to continue for quite a few years, and again, it's going to get worse. In a year or two, unless things change, as these plants come offline, the situations that are calling for rolling blackouts, it's definitely going to be worse.
Yeah, it's my understanding that about 11% of the coal plants are going to come off within the next year, and I'm just looking at MISO's right now. currently they're getting 15% of their energy from wind and 1.75 for solar, where they're getting 33, almost 34% from coal and 34% from natural gas. So when you're taking more coal plants off, that's just going to put more stress on it. We do have one more question here. When should the healthcare sector expect to have the meeting with City Water, Light and Power?
Yeah, we'll be meeting with the hospitals essentially probably later this week or next week.
Okay, and then the last next question: what contingencies do you recommend for any business who has an elevator without a power backup?
That's a tougher question. I don't really think there's anything they can do. I mean, they have to have what their plans are for when an elevator is stuck like that. But not having a backup is definitely of a concern. But there's nothing that we can plan for differently. Again, the only thing we can do is try to limit the amount of time that these places are out of power for these rolling blackouts to 15 minutes. And like I said, other utilities, I think Ameren's going with an hour and a half. I think Mid-America, that's up north, is going with 60 minutes. So they're down to an hour, but we're the only utility I know of that's going to try to limit to 15 minutes. So it's definitely an inconvenience.
Yeah, regardless, when someone's stuck in an elevator, usually the fire department gets called upon to, free them up. So that's where you'd want to make your call.
That's what I was going to
Fire department.
suggest.
What was that, Scott?
I was going to suggest contacting fire safety ahead of time and coming up with a contingency plan with fire safety. They would be the ones that will respond to that.
Very good. Well, we're right at 4 o'clock. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, there's one.
Yep. Is City Water, Light and Power working to develop a written plan that would indicate an approach to how the outages would take place?
So essentially, it depends upon some factors, right? You can't just dictate exactly this is how you're going to approach it, because it depends on how much load has to be shed. So the quantity of megawatts that have to be removed from the grid is basically the driver where the dispatchers and operators, they look at what the loads are for each circuit, and they determine which circuits that fit that need, and they'll start cycling through those circuits. But again, trying to make sure it's fair, they'll from event to event, they'll start at a new batch of circuits as best they can.
Okay. Once again, I really appreciate your time, Doug, Amber, and Scott, and I appreciate all the help you've given us. Hopefully, we talk about this being worst case scenario, that we won't face worst case scenario, but I always think it's great to have a plan in place, and so we won't be caught off guard. And once again, if anybody has any other questions that they weren't able to ask, or if they think about it later, please send me an email. I put it in the chat, and my email is also available on our website. And thank you, Mayor, for joining us as well. And let's all work together and get through this. Okay? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.